Hey folks, Amanda here. Just a quick heads up that from time to time, the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast does include some adult language. So if you've got kids with you, you may just want to hold on to this episode to listen to a little later. Enjoy! Welcome back to the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast, the show for people who are ready to break out of survival mode in order to build a truly thriving life. I'm Amanda Sollman, and along with Mark Jewell and the rest of my team here at Mark Jewell Speaking and Training, we break down common roadblocks that keep people stuck surviving and share ideas to help you thrive each and every day. If I know one thing to be true about working in corporate America, small business, doesn't matter, it is that learning how to work with your manager is incredibly difficult. Right? Now, I know there's some of you out there who are probably like, I get along great with my boss. We work really well together. And if that's you, awesome. 2 thumbs up. But if the number of conversations I've had on coaching calls and in managers updates and just among my team is any indication, learning to work effectively with a manager is hard. It's difficult, but it's also really, really critical. If you look at any of the research out there, especially from Gallup, it will tell you, right? That relationship with your manager is one of the key dictating factors of whether you stay or go in a job. Managers are often the biggest reasons people either stay or go. And so if that relationship with your manager is that critical, but it's also that hard, we've got to spend some time figuring out how to make it better. So let's back up though, and let's talk about why that relationship can be difficult for some of us. I think first and foremost, right, as with any type of relationship, there's personalities, right? People have different attitudes, different opinions, different values, and they just show up differently, right? All of us are very unique, and sometimes our uniqueness can feel in conflict with other people's uniqueness, and that is no different in a manager-employee relationship. So another thing that I think makes the relationship with a manager sometimes difficult to really invest in is that, just by the nature of what you do, that position or that person has a level of positional authority over you. Right? They have the ability to fire you, to give you a raise, to tell you what to do, right? And so sometimes we feel at odds with the need to ask questions or push back or do anything that feels at odds with the story we have in our head about what positional authority looks like and how you interact with someone who has positional authority over you. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that idea later, but I think that's just like an obvious dynamic between a manager and an employee that sometimes can be a challenge. Okay. Another thing that can be hard is that just the sheer nature of the fact that you and your manager hold 2 different roles can sometimes create situations where you have 2 different goals, right? I sometimes think about this that, those of you who are, I don't know the best way to describe it, but maybe like, you're on the front line, right? You're doing the work, you're holding the client relationship, you are, executing on the very tactical things. Like that is your job as a frontline employee, is to do the work, get the work done. Whereas when you move into levels of leadership, you become more responsible for, things like strategy, things like vision. You start looking at things at a much bigger picture level. And so sometimes when you as an employee are in the details and the tactical things and your boss is really at a higher level strategic thinking type role, that can create some conflict, and so that idea of having different roles and different goals sometimes can be at odds. here's one that I think a lot of people forget, and it is a critical part of this conversation, is that something that can make that manager-employee relationship really tough is that in a lot of organizations, your manager has really never been taught how to manage, how to lead. Now, I don't want to take anything away from those of you who are managers out there. A lot of managers really, do have a level of just natural leadership ability. A lot of you learn that along the way and become really great managers over time. But especially in situations, I just want to call out where, maybe you have a younger manager or someone who is managing a team for the first time. Unless you work in an organization who really invests in teaching people what it means to manage and lead, which if you do, kudos, awesome. But for most organizations, someone gets moved into management because they were really good at what they used to do. Right? The person who was a really good salesman gets moved into, the regional sales director or something like that, right? You used to be really good at this. And so, hey, promotion time, you get to lead people now. Just because you were good at what you used to do doesn't necessarily mean that you're great at managing. And some people will invest in themselves to get better at that skill set, and some will not. And so I just want you to keep in mind, giving your manager a little bit of grace, because just like you've got to learn how to do your job, a lot of times they have to learn how to do their job too. And that takes time, it takes experience, it takes feedback. And we're going to talk about all of those things. And then finally, the last thing that I think can make these employee-manager relationships challenging is that sometimes the qualities that make someone a really good leader or a really good senior type person in an organization are not the same qualities that make someone a really good frontline employee. And so this kind of plays back into that earlier comment I made about, you're in different roles and have different goals accordingly. And that also goes beyond just, hey, what is your responsibility? But it also goes to a kind of talent and skill level, in that, in my experience, as you look at an organization and who sits in more senior positions versus more junior positions, something that really good people in more senior positions have is this ability to be more strategic, more higher level, more big picture. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be a great leader, if you are a more tactical, detail-oriented person. I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is, when you're kind of in that day-to-day frontline employee role, it's your job to focus on the details. It's your job to make sure no balls are dropped, or that you're balancing all your plates in the air. Pick your analogy. But when you're more in a senior management position, you're playing chess now. Right? You're not just a single piece. You are looking at all the pieces on the board and trying to figure out where they fit. And again, that disconnect between what the role and responsibility of somebody in a management or senior leadership position is different than what it is to be kind of boots on the ground in that junior level position. And so all of these things added together do make that relationship, and building that relationship and feeling out, what's best and how do we work best together, it can be challenging. And I guess I say all of that because I get it. I want to back up and tell you a story about an experience I had early in my career that really started to serve as a game changer for how I thought about the manager-employee relationship and how I relate to my managers, that I think really starts to get at some of these challenges and gives us a way to think about how to work through them. So when I was early in my career, I started out in the world of marketing and advertising. And I had this manager who I loved, right? She really pushed me and challenged me to grow. I still to this day say that my time with her as a manager is when I really went from, being that fresh out of college kid to really having a set of skills and abilities, that continue to serve me to this day. But early on, so let me back up. I'll tell you, something about this manager is she is exactly what I was describing to you earlier. She is big picture, strategic, creative. I sometimes laugh because with the 1,000,001 ideas that would be running through her head at any given time, I almost was like, how does she show up to the office with matching shoes any given day, right? Because her brain, it just goes in a million different directions. And it was great for our clients because I will tell you, she challenged our clients to think about things differently, to consider, approaches or ideas that they've never thought of before. But that same strategic idea, creative, million things running through her head at any given time, early on, I felt very challenged by that as a junior team member because I would find myself waiting for her to give me direction, waiting for her to give me feedback, waiting for her to provide clarification. Or I'd find myself taking action and then finding out that I missed a critical piece of information or I did it wrong. And I was so frustrated. And the wheels of negativity start turning in my head of why doesn't she just tell me what she wants? Why isn't she super clear with the directions? Why does she never give me feedback, right? I've heard many of these same phrases from some of you that I've worked with. So I don't blame you at all because I have been there. And in a moment of frustration, I was expressing these things to her, and she looked at me and said, Amanda, I understand what you are looking for, but I need you to remember that you are not my only priority. I am not thinking about you every minute of every day. I've got, requests from the people above me. I've got requests from our clients. I've got requests from other junior team members like yourself. And I am not thinking about you all the time and what you need. I need you to start managing up to me a little more effectively so that you can get what you need to be successful. Now, I'll be honest, this was the first time I had heard the phrase managing up. This is not something they teach you in college. This is not something they teach you in your internships. And so at the time, I didn't totally know exactly what she meant, but I did know that what she was telling me was super, super important. And so before I get to what it does mean to manage up and how you can start building that skill or build on your own skills in that way, I want to take a detour just for a minute and lay out a few myths about the manager-employee relationship that I think come up a lot, because I think they're going to be really important for you to understand managing up as a concept. So the first myth about how managers and employees should interact with each other is that this is a strictly top-down order-taking relationship, right? Your boss says jump, you say how high. And I think this comes from a few places. Now, one, I think it does come from maybe an earlier generation of workplace expectations, right? I think of, I'm from Michigan, so I think of like automobile manufacturing and that sort of thing where, it is pretty hierarchical and, the manager tells you to do something, you do it, right? And I think that has been more of the case in previous generations in the workplace than maybe it is now. But I still think that mindset hangs out there for a lot of us, that the boss's word is the last word. And so that shows up. I also think, sometimes you can think of it too. There's applications from the military, right? If your general or whatnot tells you to do something, you just do it. And so that sort of carries over. The other thing, and this is one that comes up for me, is that I think we look at management very similar to the way we look at parent-child dynamics, right? And so if you were raised in a household like me, where you don't question what your parents tell you to do, right? They tell you to do something, you do it. Same thing with teachers, right? They tell you to do something, you do it. And you don't question, you don't push back, you don't give lip, none of that, right? And so what happens is we then transfer that view of authority to our boss, right? And so now, instead of my mom or my dad telling me something and I just do it, I just wait for my boss to tell me something and I just do it, right? Remember I said, though, this is a myth. And we're going to talk about how we break that here in a moment. The second myth that I think comes up when we're talking about the manager-employee relationship is my boss should just fill in the blank. My boss should just tell me what they want. My boss should just give me feedback. My boss should just know what I'm doing. My boss should just understand my role. I have heard all of these and more in coaching clients or in coaching calls at some point in time, right? Now here's a tip for you, and it doesn't matter if it's in this context or another context. Anytime you find yourself saying out loud or in your head, they should just, should is a red flag word, right? Because what someone should know or what someone should do, it's really irrelevant, right? What's actually happening, what they're actually doing, that's what really matters. And so we need to break this cycle of my boss should just, right? Because if we're going to stay in that mindset, we're going to get nowhere other than resentment and frustration and anger. Okay. So 2 myths we've got to battle. One, that manager employee is strictly top down, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And that myth that my boss should just fill in the blank. Okay. Now, keeping that in mind, let's talk about what managing up means. Okay. So a really general idea of how I define managing up is that you, the employee, take an active role in creating two-way communication channels with your manager. Okay. So let's break that apart and look at it. So part 1, you, the employee, take an active role. This is all about taking initiative in the communication, starting the conversation, asking questions. This is about advocating for what you need. Right? We have to flip the myth on its head that manager-employee is strictly top-down. Right? We have got to stop waiting for our manager to read our minds and tell us what we think they should be telling us. They are not mind readers. And so part of managing up is that you take an active role in advocating for what you need in whatever way you need to have that conversation. Okay? The second part of the definition, creating two-way communication channels with your manager. Now again, this battles that myth of top-down only. But what I really want you to start thinking about is that the dynamic between manager and employee, this is a relationship with dialogue that goes in both ways. Your boss is not your parent, and you are not a child. Your boss is not a general in the army, and you are not a pawn. You're partners in getting the work done. You're partners in serving your customers, and you are partners in moving the company toward its goals. right? I think often as more junior people, we minimize our value, right? We assume that our manager has more value than we do. And so therefore we just take orders. When in reality, we both bring value to the organization. We just bring it in different ways. And therefore we need to work together as a team. Now that to me is what managing up is. I do want to run a highlighter over what managing up is not. Okay? Managing up is not being obstinate or fighting and arguing with your boss just for the sake of it. Right? I had someone recently tell me, no, when I give somebody a direction, I expect them to follow it. And to some extent, I get that, right? But if the direction is off strategy or not in line with our priorities or against our values, shouldn't somebody be raising their hand and saying, hey, take a time out? Right? This is not my way or the highway. Again, this is a partnership. And so I am supporting, and I do support, and I tell my clients, I tell the managers that I work with, I do encourage if someone has a question or if someone thinks, a direction is not on target with where the team wants to go, they should be raising their hand and they should be doing it respectfully. So again, managing up is not being a jerk. So if you think that's what I said, rewind, start over, listen again. It's not about being disrespectful. It's about standing up when needed, asking clarifying questions, challenging the status quo, and doing it respectfully as a member of the team. So far in this conversation, we've talked about why that manager-employee relationship is hard. We've talked about the myths that sometimes underlie that difficulty. We talked about what managing up is, right? It's that you taking an active role in leading two-way communication between you and your boss. And we've talked about what managing up is not. It is not about being a stick in the mud or obstinate just for the sake of it. And it's not about being a jerk. Okay. So now I want to give you a few tools for your toolbox that can help you practice those managing up abilities. Okay. And again, I'll highlight, it takes practice. We're not going to be good at this overnight. And frankly, we're not going to be good at this every day, even when we have practiced it, right? I fall on my face when it comes to managing up from time to time or often. I guess I should ask Mark that question, but we're not going to be perfect at this all the time. All we ask is, again, that you take that initiative, that you put yourself out there and try to work on this relationship. Because again, that manager-employee relationship is critical to your long-term satisfaction and honestly, long-term sustainability with that company or with that job. So let's look at 3 different ways that you can manage up. The first strategy that I like to recommend is to have you prospect your boss. Now, in the context of sales, right, prospecting happens when you're going out, talking to potential new customers, and you're having what we refer to as discovery conversations, right? You're trying to learn about them, try and figure out if you'd be a good fit for their business, try and figure out what they need, what problems could you help them solve. And it's really obvious to us to do this prospecting in the context of sales. And we very rarely think about doing it in the context of internal relationships within our company. And so one of the first things that I always recommend to my clients is go have that discovery question or have that discovery conversation that you would have with a customer and adapt it and have it with your boss. Right? So ask your boss, what are their goals? What are their individual goals? What are their team goals? What are the goals for the organization? And what role do they play in achieving those? Ask them how they prefer to be communicated with. right? We've mentioned it on this podcast before, but Mark will tell you, right, he'd much rather have you shoot him a quick text than shoot him an email because of just where he is at any given time. And it's just easier for him to get back to you on that. Now, you could imagine a world where I didn't know that was his communication preference, and I'm just shooting him email after email after email and getting frustrated and angry and resentful when he doesn't respond in the time frame that I want. Right? And we do these things all the time. And so part of that prospecting conversation, that discovery conversation with your boss, how do they like to be communicated with? How often do they like to be communicated with, right? Do they want, a weekly update, a daily update? How does that look for them? Do they want it, via email, a phone call? Do they want you to stop in to the office? If you're a remote employee or someone who's on the road a lot, do they want to see your face a certain amount of time? Ask them those questions, because then you are better equipped to fulfill on what they're looking for. And then another piece of it, that this conversation could include lots of different pieces, but another piece that I would highly encourage as a part of that discovery conversation, it is, what are their expectations of you? Right? I think this happens a lot, especially earlier in your career, where on one hand, maybe you're not quite totally sure what your role is supposed to be, right? Because you're just new to it. Or maybe you're in a position where a role has been created for you, which is super cool, but you're just not quite sure what it's supposed to look like. That discovery conversation and asking them, hey, Mr. Manager or Ms. Manager, what do you expect from me in this role? That can be a really, really helpful conversation to have. Now, I definitely recommend this conversation early on in a job. I work with a lot of early career folks, and I always encourage them to try and have this conversation in the first few months on the job, because it's going to save you some headache down the road. But I think this is a conversation, one, you can have at any time for the first time. And two, I think it's a conversation you should actually have quite frequently, not just once a year when you have your performance review, but, check in every 6 months, every 8 months, and just make sure, am I still communicating with you in the way you want to be seeing? Am I still meeting the expectations you have for me in this role, or have those changed, right? And again, I encourage the initiation of that conversation to come from you, the employee, not necessarily from your boss. It shows a lot of initiative. It also shows your manager that that you care about them too, right? I think this is another fallout of our top-down myth, is that we expect our managers to care about us, but we don't always send that in the other direction. So by initiating a conversation where I'm asking you, what are your goals? What are you trying to achieve? What are you struggling with? It shows a level of care that I think the higher up you go in an organizational food chain, so to speak, tends to fade the closer you get to the top. So prospecting your boss, having that discovery question or discovery conversation, one of the first things you can do to practice that skill of managing up. Okay. The second strategy is proactive communication. I see people falling down on this constantly because we get ourselves into this trap, going back to the myth, that if my boss wants to know what I'm doing, she should just ask. If my boss wants to know what's struggle or what's a challenge or where I'm succeeding, he should just come and talk to me, right? That should word shows up again. Stop it. I know it sounds silly, but we've got to break out of that mindset. It is so dangerous. Instead, I want you to be proactively communicating with your manager. Now, do that in the context of the communication styles and preferences that you heard about from them earlier when you were prospecting them and asking discovery questions. But I want you to be talking to them about, where are you at? What are you working on? What roadblocks, what challenges are you running into? Where do you need some assistance? What kind of feedback do you need? Do you need some resources, right? Do we need to look at budget or timelines or people or fill in the blank, right? What is going on? Keeping that manager in the loop. Right? If I go back to my story with my manager earlier, that's what I found out. That was the step I was really skipping. She wanted to hear from me more often, and me being the initiator of that conversation, right? Because it's my job to advocate for myself and what I need to be successful. She wanted me to be talking to her more frequently about what I was working on, what I needed help with, how things were going, instead of just coming to her when there were problems, right? Instead of just going to her when things weren't working. And so that is something that I would really encourage you to start practicing. Ideally, that's at least once a week. On our team here at MJST, we have a weekly huddle where, we're fully remote, so everybody gets on video chat, and that's what we talk about. What's going on in the schedule for the week? What are people working on? What do they need help with? So again, it's not just your manager, it can be your full team, but there is dedicated time every week to make sure we know where people are at and what's going on. For many of you who listen to this, who might work in the agriculture sector, obviously we work with a lot of folks in that business. The spring, as we come here into planting, is going to get nuts, right? And if you are not purposefully creating time to make sure your manager knows where you're at and what you're doing, that is a recipe for problems. Find a time, set an alarm. I don't care what you do, but make sure that you are regularly checking in with your manager and bringing them up to speed on what you're doing. And the third thing that I would encourage you to do is to continue or start practicing those skills of setting and managing expectations with your manager. Now, we've done an entire podcast episode on setting and managing expectations, which I will link to in the show notes. And this is something that, it's a skill that applies both with a manager as well as with your customers or your clients. So I would really encourage you to jump back and listen to that full episode. But just as a recap, setting expectations is all about making sure that you understand what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, when it needs to be done, and in your manager's eyes, what does success look like? Right? Again, this goes back to asking clarifying questions, making sure that, you understand what you're supposed to be doing in pretty minute detail. Because remember, we talk about this in our live trainings. We've talked about this on podcasts. We've talked about this in our office hours sessions, which I will talk a little bit more about at the end of the podcast. But remember, in order to execute at a high level, we must have a strong level of clarity and certainty, right? And when it comes to working with your manager, clarity is so key. And so making sure that you are setting expectations with them, understanding their expectations, and keeping you both on the same page. The managing expectations side of this is all about what do we do when things change, right? So I would run into this at the agency. We'd all be on the same page, marching in the same direction. And then the client would call and say, our budget got cut. We have to relook at this project. Right? Now, on one hand, as the account manager, I need to deal with that with the client, with our internal team, but it's also on me to go to my manager and make sure they understand, especially if it's a really important project. Hey, so-and-so client just called. Here's what happened. Here's how I'm going to handle it. I've already had a conversation with so-and-so at the agency. Is there any other items I should be keeping in mind or thinking about? And if they say, nope, you're good, I like where you're going, cool. If they say, hey, thanks for letting me know, here's a couple of other things you might want to consider, that's great feedback, right? But I'm never going to get that if I don't keep them in the loop. Okay. The other place where setting and managing expectations comes into play with a manager in particular is when it comes to what's on your plate and priorities. Right? I talk about this in that setting and managing expectations earlier podcast episode, but it's really easy for people from all directions to be giving you assignments, giving you directions, asking you to do things. And it's not that we don't want to execute on those requests, but the reality is we all only have so much capacity, right? Certain tasks take certain amounts of time, and we can't do a million things at once. Right? And so one thing that's really important with setting and managing expectations with your manager is letting them know what's on your plate and making sure that what you think are the priorities are what they think are the priorities, so that they don't come back to you and go, why aren't you working on this? And you go, oh, I thought I should be working on this. And they say, no, I want you to be working on that, right? That's where problems come in. By making sure that your manager is aware of the things that are on your plate and, depending on how frequently you touch base on any given week or any given day, they can make better calls when they're moving around those proverbial chess pieces that I mentioned earlier, because they might say, oh man, Amanda's already got a lot of items on her plate that are super high priority. If I need help with this thing, I need to go find somebody else, or I need to just expect that Amanda's not going to be getting to it for a while. Or they could say, hey, no, Amanda, this thing is actually more important than those things that you're already working on. So here's how I would like you to do some reshuffling. Right? But they can't do that if they don't know what's on your plate. And so instead of you sitting in the background getting pissed off and resentful about, oh, they just keep giving me things. Don't they know I'm already super, super busy? No, they don't. Right? They don't know you're overwhelmed if you don't tell them. Right? So setting expectations is also about making sure that they know what you're working on so that they can make adjustments accordingly. So as you continue to practice this idea of managing up, taking an active role in two-way communication with your boss, not just standing around waiting for them to give you an order, you need to be spending some time prospecting your boss, having a discovery conversation. You need to be engaging in proactive communication. And you need to be practicing setting and managing expectations along the way. Now, before I close out this episode, I do want to send a message to those managers who are listening to this episode. I have been harping quite a bit on those who are not the ones in that positional leadership role. But if you are a manager of a team, you are not off the hook, right? You still have a responsibility to communicate clearly and often with your team. They should not have to track you down every time they need something, right? Now, if they do need something, it is on them to advocate for themselves, right? That's what we just spent the whole episode talking about. But you're not off the hook in making sure that you are also being proactive from your side of the world. That same thing goes for setting expectations, for giving feedback. Those are still your responsibilities. All I'm saying is that you're not the only one responsible for them, which I think sometimes we get into the trap of thinking. Okay. Another thing that I want managers to keep in mind, I know I've fallen into this trap as a manager, and I've seen others as well. Be very careful of letting your ego get in the way of that two-way dialogue. Okay. I think there are some of us out there who feel really good about the fact that we're in positional leadership because it means we can give orders, right? No longer do we just have to be the taker of orders. We now get to be the ones giving them, right? And so if we find ourselves in a situation where an employee is asking us, is that really our highest priority right now? Or is that really on strategy with where we're going? That can feel, that can be a little dig on the ego because I'm the boss and they should just listen to me, right? And so again, watch for that. Watch for that visceral reaction to, I might call it a challenge to your authority, but I don't even know that it's really a challenge, but be careful to being really irritated if people question what you're telling them to do, because what I want you to remember as a manager, and this is actually some phrasing, I just finished the book Wolfpack by Abby Wambach, and she talked about the fact that you're not building followers. You are cultivating future leaders. Right? You're not here to have your ego stroked and build a team of people who just listen to whatever you say. You are here to build leaders for the future. And this skill of managing up, what I've been talking about, this idea of taking initiative, advocating for yourself, communicating more proactively, not only will this make your team more effective, it will help those individuals who want to lead teams of their own in the future. It will make them better managers. And so sometimes that means they have to, quote unquote, challenge authority, right? They have to ask those hard questions. They have to push back on the status quo, right? They might have to, ask for what they want, even though they may not get it, right? I had a client who was really interested in getting a raise, right? We're all going to be in that position at some point in time where we want to ask for a raise. And I really pushed her to have that conversation with her boss, right? And at the time, her boss was a little bit like, oh, doesn't she know we don't have money for this, or we don't da-da-da-da-da, right? Like, a little taken aback, but I didn't really care whether she got the raise or not. I wanted her to practice managing up and asking for what she thought she was worth, because that skill is important, right? And that same thing goes with asking those clarifying or seemingly challenging questions. It might be uncomfortable for you as a manager to feel questioned or to feel challenged. But I will tell you, it is good for your employee to practice those self-advocacy questions, and it's good for you to have to defend your stance. So that, my friends, is the concept of managing up. What it is not, and how you can start practicing that skill. So before I leave you today, I do just want to put in a little plug. MJST is offering a new coaching option called Office Hours, where each of our coaches jumps on a Zoom webinar, and for part of the conversation, they teach on a topic of their choosing. So they share some insight with you. You get to have an open conversation about it. And then the second part of that call is an open coaching call. So if you've never tried coaching, if you'd like to give it a shot, you can attend Office Hours and kind of get a feel for what that's like to work with one of our coaches. We have lots of different coaches, lots of different topic areas, and we are always adding new ones to the schedule. So if that is something you are interested in, I would encourage you to download the Mind Body app, Mind Body, and search for Mark Jewell Training. You may have to set the radius to within 50 miles of Omaha. There's some quirks to that, but search for Mark Jewell Training in the Mind Body app and get yourself signed up for an office hours session of your choosing. With that, as always, remember, survival is dead. It's your time to thrive today. Have a great week. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode. If you like what you heard, make sure to jump over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. We appreciate the feedback, and it helps other people find the show. On that same note, if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to share it with a friend. As always, if you're looking for more resources to go from surviving to thriving, check out our website at www.markjewelltraining.com. That's Jewel with 2 L's. And you can find us under Mark Jewell Speaking and Training on all the major social networks. Remember, survival is dead. It's your time to thrive today. See you next week.